Welcome back to Beyond the Scoreboard. I would like to begin today with a simple question. Have you ever looked back on a period of your life and wondered, how did I get here? Not necessarily somewhere bad, just somewhere unexpected. Maybe you drifted away from a goal that once mattered deeply. Maybe a relationship slowly changed. Maybe your habits became different. Maybe your standards became different. What is fascinating is that those moments rarely happen because of one dramatic decision. Most of the time, they happen quietly, almost invisibly, one ordinary decision at a time. I don't think people wake up one morning and decide to lower their standards. I don't think a coach begins a season hoping effort becomes optional. And I don't think parents hope respect slowly disappears from their home. And I do not believe teachers want curiosity to fade away from their classroom. Or I do not believe leaders hope honesty becomes negotiable. Yet somehow these things happen, and not because people stop caring, but because they slowly become accustomed to what they once would have challenged. That to me is one of the most fascinating truths about human nature. We adapt. We adapt to almost everything. We adapt to pain, success, pressure, failure, excellence, mediocrity. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. It is one of our greatest strengths. It allows us to survive, to recover, to rebuild, and to begin again. But every strength carries a hidden danger. The same ability that allows us to adapt to excellence also allows us to adapt to decline. And decline is almost never dramatic. It whispers. One excuse, one shortcut, one compromise, one difficult conversation avoided, one promise postponed, then another. Until one day something that once bothered us no longer feels unusual. Not because it became right, because it became familiar. Perhaps familiarity is one of the most powerful forces in our lives. The longer we live with something, the less likely we are to question it. Think about walking into a room with a clock. At first, the ticking seems loud. After 10 minutes, you barely hear it. Think about the clock changed. You changed. Your mind adapted. Life works in much the same way. We became accustomed to environments, attitudes, behaviors, language, expectations. Eventually, we stop seeing them altogether. As a coach, I have seen this happen many, many times. A team begins the season with clear expectations. Everyone arrives early, players communicate, energy is high, accountability is natural. Then one player arrives late. The coach notices but says nothing. Perhaps the player had a good reason. Perhaps the coach is tired. Perhaps it simply doesn't feel worth addressing. After all, it happened only once. The following week, another player arrives late. Again, nothing is said. A month later, practices begin 5 minutes late almost every day. Nobody remembers exactly when punctuality stopped mattering. Nobody voted for lowering standards. Nobody announced a change. The culture just simply shifted very quietly. That's how culture usually changes, not through revolutions, through repetition. This lesson extends far beyond basketball. Well, imagine a classroom. At the beginning of the year, students are excited. They participate. They ask questions. They encourage one another. Then one student begins making sarcastic comments. Nobody addresses it. Another joins in. Soon, curiosity is replaced by fear. Students stop raising their hands, not because they no longer care about learning, because the culture quietly changed. Or think about a family. One impatient response, one ignored apology, one evening where everyone chooses their phone instead of conversation, none of those moments seem significant on their own. But families are not shaped by extraordinary days. They are shaped by ordinary evenings repeated hundreds of times. The same is true in friendships. The same is true in marriages. The same is true in workplaces, in churches, in society itself. When enough people accept something, it begins to feel normal. And once something feels normal, questioning it becomes difficult. And perhaps that's why wisdom is not simply knowing what is right. Wisdom is noticing what everyone else has stopped noticing. It is recognizing the small compromises before they become permanent habits. It is asking uncomfortable questions before comfort quietly replaces conviction. I sometimes wonder if the greatest threat to our character is not failure. Well, perhaps it's familiarity. Because familiarity has a remarkable ability to make almost anything seem acceptable. Which leads me to a question I have been asking myself more often over the years. Not what do I believe, but what have I stopped noticing? Because those may not be the same question. And perhaps one of the greatest responsibilities of a leader and a parent, a teacher, a coach, or simply a thoughtful human being is to keep noticing the things that truly matter, even when everyone else has stopped seeing them. As I have thought about this over the years, I have come to realize that leadership has very little to do with authority. Authority can make people obey, it can make people believe, but real leadership is something much quieter. It is the ability to shape an environment where certain values become so deeply rooted that people continue to live by them even when no one is watching. That's why culture is one of the most misunderstood words in leadership. We often talk about culture as though it's something we create with a speech and mission statement or a list of core values printed on a wall. But culture has never been created by words alone. Culture is created by repetition, by consistency, by what people experience every single day. A basketball team may say they value accountability, but if nobody's held accountable, accountability is not part of the culture then. A school may say it values respect, but if disrespect is repeatedly ignored, students eventually learn a different lesson. A company may say integrity comes first, but if honesty disappears whenever it becomes inconvenient, people quickly discover what the real values are. Life has taught me that people rarely believe what we announce. They believe what we consistently demonstrate. That realization changed the way I think about coaching too. When I was younger, I believed my job was to teach basketball. Over time, I realized basketball was simply the classroom. The real lesson was never the game itself, it was how people learned to work together, how they handled disappointment, how they responded to correction, how they treated one another when nobody was paying attention. Those lessons last much longer than any season. And years later, very few athletes remember every drill. Very few remember every score, and very few remember every squatting report. They remember how the environment made them feel. They remember whether effort mattered, whether honesty mattered, whether teammates cared for one another, whether excellence was expected, whether character mattered more than talent. Those are the things that remain. Perhaps that's why the greatest coaches are remembered long after the final whistle. Not because they won the most games, because they shaped people. And shaping people has always been far more important than collecting trophies. The same is true of teachers. Years after graduation, most students cannot remember every lesson they studied. Yet, they often remember a teacher who believed in them, a teacher who challenged them, a teacher who expected more from them than they expected from themselves. The information fades, the influence remains. Parents understand this perhaps better than anyone. Children are remarkable observers. They notice far more than adults realize. They notice patience. They notice anger. They notice honesty and kindness. Most importantly, they notice consistency. Children do not become who their parents hope they become, or often they become what they repeatedly see. That thought humbles me, because it reminds me that influence is rarely loud. It's usually quiet. Ordinary, almost invisible. It happens around dinner tables, during practice, in hallways, in classrooms, during car rides, in the conversations we barely remember having. One sentence, one response, one decision, repeated often enough to become someone's understanding of what is normal. Perhaps that's why the smallest moments deserve our greatest attention. Not because they seem important today, but because they may become important years from now. I often wonder how many lives have changed because someone chose to have one difficult conversation instead of avoiding it. How many athletes stayed in sport because one coach believed in them? And how many students found confidence because one teacher refused to let them give up? And how many families healed because one person chose forgiveness over pride? History rarely remembers those moments, yet history is often shaped by them. That's why I no longer believe leadership is measured by visibility. I think leadership is measured by responsibility. It is measured by how we protect and when protecting it becomes inconvenient. It's measured by the standards we refuse to compromise when compromise would make life easier. Because every compromise teaches us something. Sometimes it teaches flexibility. Sometimes it teaches wisdom. But when compromise becomes a habit rather than an exception, it slowly teaches us what we are willing to become. That may be the greatest danger of all. Not making one mistake, but slowly becoming a person who no longer notices the mistake. Perhaps this is why self reflection matters so much. Before we ask how to change the culture around us, we must first ask what culture exists within us. What attitudes have I accepted simply because they become familiar? What habits have I stopped questioning? What conversations have I continued postponing? What standards have quietly disappeared from my own life? Those questions are uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the beginning of wisdom. The ancient philosophers believe that the unexamined life is a life lived without understanding. I think coaching has taught me something similar. The unexamined culture is a culture that eventually begins to shape us instead of being shaped by us. And perhaps that's the invitation of today's conversation. Not to become more critical of other people, to become more attentive to ourselves. To notice the small things before they become permanent things. Protect what matters before it quietly disappears. To understand that leadership begins long before anyone gives us a title. Because every one of us is shaping an environment somewhere, a family, a classroom, a team, a friendship, workplace, or simply our own heart. The question is not whether we are influencing culture, the question is what kind of culture our lives are creating. So, as we close today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Years from now, people may forget many of the things you accomplished. They may forget your position, they might forget your achievements, they may even forget your words. But they will remember how it felt to be around you, whether your presence raised the standard or quietly lowered it. Because culture is never built in extraordinary moments. It is built in ordinary moments, repeated day after day, choice after choice, conversation after conversation, and perhaps that's why the standard you walk past matters so much. Not because it changes a single moment, but because over time it changes people. And in the end, changing people has always mattered more than winning games. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond the Scoreboard. Until next time, pay attention to the ordinary, because the ordinary moments of today are quietly becoming the culture of tomorrow.